Good evening. Good evening, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. My name is William Delaney, and I'm a member of the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum Committee here at the Institute of Politics. Welcome to our forum on designing inclusive organizations, which is part of Hub Week. Before we begin, note the exit doors, which are located on both the Park side and the JFK Street side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, please gather your belongings, walk to the exit closest to you, and congregate in the JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones. You can join the conversation tonight online by tweeting with the hashtag HubWeek, which is also listed in your program. Tonight's events will begin shortly. Please take your seats now and enjoy the program.
I'm Doug Elmendorf, the Dean of the Kennedy School. Welcome to the Kennedy School and the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. As you know, this event is part of Hub Week, which celebrates activities across the Boston area at the intersection of art, science, and technology. And we're delighted to have you here. Harvard is one of the founders of Hub Week, which is now in its second year. Hub Week events at Harvard include discussions, lectures, hands-on demonstrations, workshops, and more. And you can learn more opportunities by checking the schedule online. The other Hub Week event that we're hosting at the Kennedy School is a Tech for Democracy showcase and challenge presented by our Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. Tonight's event is titled What Works? Designing Inclusive Organizations, and will be led by my colleague, Iris Bohnet. Iris is professor of public policy at the Kennedy School and the director of our Women in Public Policy program. She is also the co-chair of the Behavioral Insights Group at our Center for Public Leadership and is an associate director of the Harvard Decision Science Laboratory. Earlier this year, she published a wonderful and important book, What Works? Gender Equality by Design. And this is really taking the world by storm. It offers some very important insights, and we're lucky that Iris can be here tonight to share some of this with you. We're also lucky that joining Iris will be Meghna Chakrabarti. Meghna is the host of WBUR's acclaimed weekday talk show, Radio Boston, which focuses on news, in-depth interviews with extraordinary people, and analysis of important issues. She is also the host of Modern Love, the podcast, which is a collaborative production of WBUR and the New York Times. Let's give a warm welcome to Iris Chakta, please.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Doug Elmendorf, for this very kind introduction. Thank you all for coming. It's an amazing crowd. So what I want to do in the next 10 minutes or so is share a bit about our work on what works with you tonight. In fact, I want to start by introducing you to this person here. Her name is Heidi Roizen. And Heidi Roizen is the protagonist of a case that is taught really across the world now, here at Harvard, but in many other places. And many of you might have come across this case or might have come across other types of cases. The case talks about what Heidi does. Heidi is a venture capitalist, and she's a successful venture capitalist in Silicon Valley. And the case describes her journey and what she did to become successful, creating networks, building her enterprises. The case became even more interesting because a few years later, after the original case was written, some colleagues of ours at Columbia Business School replaced Heidi's name by Howard. And then they gave half of their students the case of the protagonist being called Howard and the other half of the protagonist being called Heidi. You know what's coming? Students then were asked to evaluate Heidi and Howard, and both male and female students would agree that Heidi and Howard did a great job, but people including female students, didn't like Heidi or wanted to work with Heidi. Why is that happening? Heidi is defying our norms on two fronts. On the one hand, she's defying the norm of what a typical venture capitalist looks like. He's not female. She also defies our norms of what a good woman does. But why are our brains doing this to us? Let me show you this picture and ask you to please compare squares A and B for me. I presume that most, if not all of you, see square B as being lighter than square A. But let me cover the surroundings for you. And I imagine that about now, most everyone sees that they, in fact, have the very same color. I'm quickly going back because I see some incredulous faces here, just to make sure you trust me. So I didn't do anything to B. But what is happening in your minds is that you're making sense of a pattern that you see. In fact, I'm arguing that's how we all experience the world. We are used to certain patterns. We're used to seeing male venture capitalists. We're used to seeing female nurses. And we put people into those boxes. By covering these patterns, quite literally what I do is I liberate your mind to see square B for what it really is, another dark square. And that's very much what I want to achieve with behavioral design. I want to liberate, quite literally, liberate our minds to see talent where it really is. Let me give you an example here on what that might look like. So a few years back, in the 70s, some of our major orchestras, including the Boston Symphony Orchestra, in fact had introduced this already earlier, came up with an ingenious design innovation. They had musicians audition behind a curtain. That curtain increased the likelihood that women would advance to future rounds by 50% and helped increase the fraction of female musicians in our major symphony orchestras in this country from about 5% in the 70s to now almost 40%. So the curtain, quite literally again, liberated orchestra directors and selection committees to hear the music rather than to see whether somebody looks the part. That's the power of behavioral design. Let me take you on a quick journey on what behavioral design can do for us. Behavioral design is quite different, of course, from many of the initiatives that are currently quite popular with our organizations, whether that's private sector, public sector, or NGOs. Many organizations heavily invest in training programs, in particular in diversity training programs. And I have to give you a somewhat sobering news here. I haven't come across much evidence suggesting that diversity programs are working. Our minds, it turns out, are pretty stubborn beasts. So instead of trying to change mindsets, what we want to do is change the environments in which we live, in which we work, including those in which we learn. So let me start by talking about something quite straightforward, and that is job advertisements. It turns out that we've actually been quite rigorous about understanding what resonates with people when we think about product advertisements. But we haven't used the same kind of rigor in our job ads. Here's an example of Coca-Cola, which, as many other soft drink companies a few years back, realized that diet wasn't for men.
Yeah.
And there's lots of theories. Maybe men don't need to worry about calories, or maybe they run more, or whatever it could be. It turns out diet wasn't a word for men, didn't resonate with men. So what Coke did was it introduced Coke Zero. And Pepsi, of course, you will recall, introduced Pepsi Max. Most soft drink companies introduced something similar. I'm not saying this is good or bad. What I am saying is I'm describing the world as it is. There's lots of gendered advertisements out there. In fact, I am arguing we should use the same kind of scrutiny when we look at our job ads? Do we inadvertently, maybe unconsciously, use biased language that decreases the chances that people from traditionally disadvantaged groups apply for the job? And there is lots of evidence suggesting that's exactly what we're doing. So job ads are low-hanging fruit. This is something you should kind of start doing tomorrow. There's now software out there that allows you to copy-paste your job ad into the software. The software is going to run through the ad, going to tell you which adjectives, which words, which types of descriptions are more likely to attract men, which ones are more likely to attract women. But let's go to somewhat higher hanging fruit. And that's what happens when somebody is in the door. It turns out that this is actually a hard problem for us to crack because most everyone in this room, including I, probably think that we are good interviewers. I mean, I'm just looking at Meghna and I'm feeling that we have this connection and I would hire her tomorrow. But of course, that's where biases creep in. That's where I look for people who look like I do. That's where I look for people who share the same hobby, who root for the same sports team. So unstructured interviews, I have to tell you, unstructured interviews are the worst predictor of future performance of all the instruments that you could use. So what can you do? Move to structured interviews at the very least. A structured interview is an interview where you think about the questions beforehand, you ask the same set of 5 questions, 10 questions of every job candidate that you interview. And you force yourself to stick to those questions. And then at the end, once you're done with the evaluation process, ideally you've already given scores for the answers, you've submitted the scores to a computer, then you can have an unstructured discussion about why Harvard is such a great place to work, why, are there anything else that you want to talk about? Even better are work samples tests. Now this is probably not rocket science if I tell you that the best predictor of future performance is a task that closely mimics the kinds of tasks that you will be doing once you're in the job. So think hard about how you could bring back the job to the interview phase and give people a chance to show, to shine in their performance. The last thing I'll say about this slide is that a bit of a myth is that just having diversity on an evaluation committee is going to solve our diversity challenges. Not true. Most of these biases are shared. In my example about Heidi and Howard, the female students were as biased against Heidi as the male students. Generally, and I'm generalizing now a bit, but generally speaking, it is much more important who or what we see rather than who we ourselves are. Seeing really is believing. But you might now argue that, well, hiring is easy, but it really gets harder once you are in the door because we still have this pyramid. So what do we do when people are in the organization, when we start to have this discussion about performance appraisals and potential promotions? Let me leave you with one insight on promotions, and that's the following. Many organizations still ask their employees to self-evaluate themselves before their manager evaluates them. And then these employees share their self-evaluations with the manager. No big surprise that these self-evaluations will influence the manager. And what we found was that there are cross-cultural differences in how comfortable and used we are, for example, to brag about ourselves. And we also found these same gaps in terms of gender. So women generally tend to be less self-confident and less used to bragging because it's socially less acceptable than for men. So sharing self-evaluations with managers is just a bad practice that we should end tomorrow. But let me give you a quick sense of the fact that this is, of course, not just about talent management. It starts much earlier. In fact, it starts in schools. So here's a behavioral design that I am particularly excited about that was brought about by the research of Katie Baldiga-Kaufman, who is now at the Harvard Business School, but was one of my doctoral students here at Harvard. She basically helped to redesign the SAT. Here's what her concern was. Her concern was that if there are differences in willingness to take risk and in self-confidence, this might show up in multiple choice tests. Why? Let me give you the example of the SAT, the old SAT. The old SAT worked as follows. You were asked a question, you have 5 possible answers, you would get 1 point for every right answer, and a quarter-point deduction for every wrong answer. And some of you are nodding, like in pain, remembering what it was like. So 1 point for every right answer, a quarter-point deduction for every wrong answer, and then those of you who are nodding will also remember the training that you got saying you should guess. You can exclude one alternative. So pretty early on, it pays to guess. But of course, if we have differences in willingness to take risk, some people will be willing to guess earlier than others. And this is not a test designed to measure or even reward risk-taking. This is a test designed to measure what you know. So what Katie found was that women, in fact, are less likely to guess and more likely to skip, just leave the question unanswered. This dearly cost women on the SAT controlling for ability, controlling for what they would have known. So fast forward, then we lucked out that the College Board appointed a new chair, David Coleman, who was interested in rethinking the test more generally. And as part of that redesign, we now have a gender debiased SAT. In terms of the multiple choice part, what the College Board decided to do was to take away the penalty from wrong answers completely, arguing this is not about risk-taking. This is about what you know. But people, of course, then were concerned and criticized and said, oh my God, you're inviting wild guessing. At which point the answer has to be that we have been inviting guessing by 50% of the population for about 100 years. So that's the power of design. It can literally level the playing field. But let me, before I end, move to maybe the thorniest issue of all. And that is, how do we make diversity work? Because an important message is that diversity is work. We have to think hard about how to be inclusive, how to create inclusive environments, inclusive organizations, inclusive teams. And yes, it is partly a numbers game. It does matter whether you're the only one. If you are the only one, the only woman, the only man, the only person of color, the only Swiss, the only economist, whatever it might be, you will be taken as a token. So numbers do matter, and roughly we're thinking that having 3 of a kind, or roughly about a third, really changes the dynamics on a team. But it's not just a numbers game. It also matters how you structure your teams, what kind of processes you have, and what norms you live in your diversity work. In fact, let me give you an example and ask you a simple question here. Where would you be more likely to drop a piece of paper? Probably on the left beach, on the dirty beach. Now ask yourself the kind of meeting or the kind of team that you're part of. Is this the kind of environment where nobody thinks about dropping a dirty joke? Or is this the kind of environment where people feel entitled to overlook certain contributions, to interrupt people, to not give credit to people who made the comments? So we have to also think very hard about the procedures, the norms that we uphold in our interactions. Let me end with this, though. Here's something all of you should do tomorrow when you go back to your schools, to your dorms, to your organizations, your companies, to your agencies. And that is, take a look at the pictures and the portraits on your walls. Are they inclusive? Are they representative of who we are in this world? So this is a portrait project that the Kennedy School started a few years ago, where we want to make sure that the portraits on our walls are, in fact, providing role models for everyone here at the Kennedy School and more broadly at Harvard. This is a portrait that we commissioned of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. She is the president of Liberia and also a graduate of the Kennedy School. If you want to know more about some of the insights that I shared with you, go visit our Gender Action Portal. The Women in Public Policy program provides this online resource. It's free, it's open, where we summarize research for decision makers, policy makers like all of you from across the globe, so everyone can have access on what works and what doesn't work. And with that, I wish you good luck designing change. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. I hope you do Iris's homework and tomorrow morning do go to your schools or your places of work. We don't actually have any portraits hanging up at WBUR. It's all on screens. So those will be easy enough to change. So I have to say, I had the same feeling today listening to you that I did when you were on my show back in April. And that was both of a simultaneous mix of inspiration and a little sadness, because you confront us with this idea that implicit biases are so hard to overcome and change that it's actually more effective and easier to make these structural and environmental and practice changes. And of course, I still want to make the world a better place. Don't we want to continue to seek to improve the human condition?
We absolutely want to improve the human condition. So there's a backdoor, though. So first of all, let me say, I think it's both good news and bad news that unconscious bias is so prevalent. It's good news because it's about all of us. This is not about pointing fingers at the bad people out there not in this room. It's about all of us. The bad news is it's about all of us. So you know, that I think it's a two-edged sword. But there is a backdoor entry, and that is seeing is believing. So eventually, by changing the environment, by changing the portraits on our walls, we are starting to see different role models and counter-stereotypical jobs, for example, and our mindsets start to change.
Creating new patterns.
But right, exactly. But that's kind of we have to go through the process of behavior change first before our minds can follow.
Yeah. You know, I was really taken by the example that you gave of the A square and the B square. And that within the known or visual context of the grid, they seem very, very different. But you remove the information, you remove context, and then you see they're the same tone. But in the case of human beings and the workplace, for example, is there a risk of removing too much information, too much context that you may not end up seeing the whole person who you're going to hire?
Well, it's a good question. I think the most important answer has to be we have to continue to measure. Right? So I'm also a little bit on a mission to argue that the same kind of scrutiny and rigor that we use in our finance department or even in our marketing departments, we also have to apply to our human resource department. So I can't say I have all the answers already, right? Because we just don't measure enough. So we have to still measure, what kind of information do we need is actually predictive of future performance and which is not. But so I think it's an ongoing process. And the beauty is that there are now new software companies out there, new startups, who make it easy for us to, for example, blind ourselves, not just in orchestras, but blind ourselves to demographic characteristics of job applicants. So I think we have to play with this, find out what kind of work sample test, for example, is most predictive of an engineer's job, for example.
Right. So just to follow up on that point, because I can imagine for every job you can come up over time with an appropriate work sample test. But and maybe I might be changing my own mind as I ask this question, but I was wondering, for so many jobs these days, you need the combination of the hard skills and the soft skills. Yeah. Is it possible to create a work sample test in which you are accurately capturing those soft skills as well? Because I think that's one of the reasons why the face-to-face unstructured interview is so persistently popular, right? Because people think that they're adequately measuring the softer skills in the applicant.
Yeah, and no question, we should include those softer skills in our tests. And emotional intelligence, for example, there's beautiful tests kind of measuring emotional intelligence. There's beautiful tests measuring social competence. Surely there's not a test for everything, but then include it in your structured interview. and have a question, for example, that you think is predictive of what you want to measure, what competency or what value you want to measure. So I'm not arguing at the least that this is all about skills, right? There are certain values that we as an organization might actually care about, but we should be much more careful in how we measure that and really learn about what's predictive of that value that I'm particularly interested in.
So this idea of measuring the results of these structural changes, I mean, you sort of touched on it when in your talk, but what do some of the data tell us about how effective these measures are?
So, for example, blind evaluations are really increasing in importance around the world. So the UK government has just recently made an announcement that all its civil service employees going forward will be evaluated blindly, so that you don't know their demographic characteristics in the first round. The Australian government is evaluating the same thing, and to answer your question, so how effective are these things? So the Bureau of Statistics in Australia was one of the first ones, a pilot test to see what difference blind evaluations really make. And they've reported that in a very short amount of time, it has doubled the number of women in its senior leadership positions. So that's the kind of evidence we have to kind of keep collecting and understanding what's going on. One of the startups that is using this technology, has developed this technology, is called Applied. It's a UK startup. And they actually run experiments as they are using their technology. So when they work with an organization, they typically ask the organization to go with the old system, what they have always done. So that's your control group. And then evaluate the same applicants with the new system, with the software that Applied produces. And then they want to see, are we ending up with the same pool of people or with very different people? And so what they've learned, for example, this is just one specific example with a tech company, was that the tech company actually didn't have gender bias or racial bias issues, but they had disciplinary background issues. They couldn't imagine to ever hire somebody who didn't have an engineering degree. Once they were blinded to people's backgrounds and just focused on work sample tests, all of a sudden, they started to hire biologists, psychologists, just very different applicants. So that for them was the big eye-opener, right? So we can't, that's why we need to keep measuring. I can't predict beforehand necessarily what your bias is going to be, but if you measure and evaluate, you can actually learn that and improve and really benefit from 100% of the talent pool.
Oh, interesting. So I'm just trying to think of the various touch points during the course of someone's career where, these implicit biases swirl all around us, but there are certain moments where they're particularly pernicious. I mean, we're talking about hiring in the interview process. What about promotions, raises?
Yep. So sadly enough, they are pretty prevalent for performance appraisals as well.
Yeah.
And one particular challenging issue for performance appraisals is that many organizations evaluate employees based on two dimensions: on past performance, literally often on the x-axis, and future potential. And as you might imagine, again, it doesn't feel like it's rocket science, performance is easier to evaluate. We're looking backwards, it's more quantifiable, it has to do with your job description, but bias really kicks in when we look at potential, because that's when I start to fill in the blanks. Who might have potential in our organization? What can I take as a cue, to answer that question? Well, it's the kind of people who've probably succeeded in this organization before. And so that's a place that's ripe for bias. Now, I'm not saying potential is not helpful. I totally get that there are moments where you might have, let's go with the engineering degree that I mentioned before, and you want to switch to a managerial job. So your past performance might not actually be predictive, right, of your future performance in your new job. And so potential is something that we have to take seriously, but what I typically advise organizations to do, although I have to say I don't have enough data yet to kind of really measure what's going on there, but at least unpack what we mean with potential. I'd be very specific. So what are you looking for? Is it communication skills? Is it team leadership skills? Is it emotional intelligence? I mean, what do I mean when I say Meghna has amazing potential?
Yeah. So I just want to switch gears a little bit, because there's something that underlies a lot of what you write in your book and have talked about here, and that is many of our current efforts, popular efforts towards diversification, I mean, you said it tonight, aren't working and might actually be harming people and organizations as well? I mean, am I going too far in saying that?
So there is a little bit of evidence of backlash, but I wouldn't push the harming point too much, other than to say that it can, of course, be harmful if it's just a checking the box activity. And we think that the work is done by sending people to a 2-hour diversity training program, right? So in that sense, it can be harmful because we're checking the box and we think the work is done. But you know, I mean, I agree with you. The big question is, why do we continue to do this? And I think there are maybe two answers. One is we actually don't really care. We actually do want to check the box. Well, that's one theory, and there's definitely organizations I have encountered for whom compliance is everything they care about, and as soon as they've checked the box, they're done. The other theory is that training programs are less disruptive in a way. Right? This is add-ons. I don't have to change how we hire or how we evaluate. We don't have to go into the procedures, into practices, but we're just adding this to the kind of things that people otherwise do, so it's an easier solution. Yeah. And I think those probably both matter in our choices today. And then, you know, not as a reason, but just generally, I would say organizations that just don't measure enough. You know, they throw, I mean, now we're thinking about $8 billion a year in this country for diversity training programs, about $14 billion a year on leadership training programs. We should just measure what works and what doesn't work.
I like that idea. I mean, although on the other hand, I think it's a little scary to people because it may be somewhat, ruthless isn't the right word, but whenever, I think some of the pushback to your idea might be it's a little too reductive, right? That there's a certain data utopianism when you're dealing with human beings that maybe they're all the things that you need to measure you can't really measure.
Yep, and I agree with that. We won't ever be able to measure everything we do, but I have to say there's a long way to go until we're there. Yeah. So we should definitely do better and not just rely on these little stereotypes in our heads kind of to make snap judgments. So yes, we can improve quite a bit, which is not to say that we'll ever, you know, be 100% there.
I'm bouncing around here, but it's so interesting what you're researching and writing and talking about, because it's this strong intersection between basic human impulses, characters. I mean, one of the things that sets human beings apart, that same pattern recognition, which gets us into trouble regarding diversity, is also one of the things that makes the human brain rather unique. Yeah. The ability to recognize patterns. It also leads to a certain form of tribalism, which is problematic here. But I think there are many work sectors, work cultures in which this I'm calling it tribalism. It's just like a brute word to use, but where it's fundamental to the culture of the workplace, right? Mm-hmm. And I'll give you a tiny story as an example. This is a sample size of 1, so not scientific whatsoever, speaking of data.
Barely.
N equals 1 in this case. But my brother, you know, he was launching a startup, seeking venture funding. And at that time, I mean, he had a pretty decent academic background and what he thought was a successful idea. He sat down with a bunch of potential investors, and he told me that one of the things that he heard repeatedly from them, and I've actually heard similarly from angel investors and other VC folks who I've talked to on my show, is that the investor is investing in the person, right? It's like the work sample in this case, the business idea is almost secondary, mm-hmm. or sometimes deliberately secondary, so that cultural, personal connection, that faith that here's a person who will maximize value over time, mm-hmm. is exactly how the decision's made. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering, in cases like that, where exactly the impulses that you're talking about, which lead to discrimination, and there's a lot of conversation about this specifically, for example, in the venture world, how do you overcome that? The whole culture is based on that.
Yeah. So, at some point, it has to be an economic decision for us as well, right? We can't forego the talent that doesn't come across as being intuitively the right person to invest in. Right? That's one of the reasons why women find it so much harder, not just women, other traditionally underrepresented groups find it so much harder to get venture capital because they don't look the part. I look at them and I'm not feeling it. I just have to give you my own little story. So I took our now 15-year-old son to a Harvard daycare center about 15 years ago, not quite, when he was 4 months old. And one of the first people I saw was a male teacher. And my heart sank. I thought, that's a horrible thing. And I felt horrible about myself like 2 seconds later, but I couldn't help that gut reaction of thinking, wow, he doesn't fit. This is not, what I expected. And so these VCs, they have the same thing. They have the same thing. So they're evaluating people, and they feel it. And does he look the part? And does he have the right skin color? And does he look like some? So I think it's a testable proposition. I would love to work with a venture capitalist, kind of saying, do your thing, feel it, and then in parallel, let's also do something a bit more objective and more data-based, and then see which company is more likely to have success. Yeah. Maybe there's some magic here. Maybe there are people who can actually read, future success. Google actually did, this is a bit of a side, but it's the same thing. Google did an interesting exercise where they, of all the Googlers who were interviewing, they actually kept track of whose interview scores are good predictors of future performance of the person at Google. And they found one person. That doesn't mean, right? So that says there are the genius out there who really feel it, but they are rare.
Wow. So, we are sitting in a room full of current and future leaders. In addition to your homework assignment, as everyone goes out into the world, regardless of what level you are at the organization, obviously, management and leadership have a huge role to play here by setting the examples and creating the priorities to make these structural changes. But are there things that individuals, at other levels of an organization can do to nudge these changes?
I would love for everyone in this room here to become a behavioral designer. I think the starting point is to be more aware that everything is designed, how these chairs are organized, how the whole room is organized, everything is designed. And so become a bit more aware of how the food is organized in your cafeteria. Is it organized in a smart way that you eat more salad rather than sweets? And what would that look like? Should it be higher up? Should it come first? Should it come second? So there's design everywhere. So become more, more intelligent about how you structure the world. But beyond that, I'd also encourage you to think about the micro inequities that you might be experiencing or that others might be experiencing in your context, whether that's in your classroom or in the boardroom, for that matter. And so one organization I worked with, again, this is not research, but I was just observing, they really wanted to work on that. And so we did two things. The first thing we did was literally write down a list of micro inequities that they cared about. And that included, I'm not given credit for my comments, I'm interrupted, I don't have the same speaking time as others, etc. So you have this whole list. And here comes then the behavioral part. Then behavioral scientists know that if we just write it down and then put it into a drawer, nothing is ever going to happen. But then you have to think about ways to nudge people to live this, even though they're well-intentioned to actually live it. So this organization then came up, this was their idea, with little red flags. And so they now have these little red flags that they raise in team meetings whenever a transgression occurred.
A literal red flag.
A little red flag. Now, you might think this is too heavy-handed or too light-handed, but they literally had that discussion of what would not criminalize transgressions. Right? They didn't want to make this kind of so horrible because it happens to all of us all the time. At the same time, salient enough for everyone to notice, and also kind of a low-cost thing that I could just do, while I talk and then kind of continue the conversation, and it wouldn't be too disruptive. That's the kind of thing that we have to start working on, where we really equalize the playing field for everyone in our organizations.
I imagine some people think that red flags would go up all the time where they work, but that nudges towards the change, right? To create the awareness. Well, I don't want to monopolize you too much because I've had a chance to talk with you before. We're going to spend about 20 minutes for questions from all of you. And there's 4 mics, as usual. There, up there, and up there. And let me give you the customary reminder. Please do introduce yourself. Keep your questions short, if possible. We're here to hear Iris. And I'm sounding a little preachy, but questions do end with a question mark rather than a period. So no statements. Inquiries are welcome about how we can change the workplace structurally to make it more diverse and more effective.
Hi, my name is Teddy. I'm a freshman over at the college. So one of the things that became really apparent in last night's presidential debate was the ways in which the debate format and really the presidential election process as a whole really is biased towards men. What sort of applications could we do with organizational design to make it a little more equitable for women?
Oh, a very astute observation, yes. These formats don't traditionally work well for women. There is, in fact, evidence supporting that. Generally, interestingly enough, there's quite a bit of research that very competitive formats don't work particularly well for women. So there's both research that women do worse under very competitive schemes, and also evidence suggesting that if you have a choice of what kind of environment you want to be in. So let me just give you an example to make this very concrete. So imagine you could be paid based on piece rate. So I'm producing something, and for every good that I produce, I get $5. Or it's a very competitive scheme where those of us who make the most widgets or whatever it is, and the best ones, they get a big prize. So that's very competitive. So at the end, you make partner or professor or something, a big prize at the end. So women don't opt for these hyper-competitive environments. And one of the reasons is that they don't perform quite as well, and they get backlash when they perform as assertively as men in those kinds of environments. And this particular election is a very interesting observation for us all to make, kind of how these different dynamics play out. Yes, absolutely.
The next debate is going to be a town hall forum. We'll see if that is a little bit different. I'm not sure it's structurally different enough. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Hiro Tanaka. I'm from the math department. There's something that bothered me a little bit about 2 of the examples of behavioral design that you used. One was the BSO hiding the gender of an applicant, and the other was the civil service in England hiding demographic data. And the reason that it bothers me is because it seems to be designing away negative bias rather than designing in positive bias. And here's what I mean. I think that, for instance, in male-dominated cultures or businesses or what have you, there is inherent value to the perspective of somebody who is not a man. And to counter the Supreme Court, there is inherent value to the perspective of a black student in a physics class. So can you speak to any research that you know of from behavioral design that rather than hiding the fact that somebody is a woman, hiding the fact that somebody is black, you can actually design in something so that policymakers and hiring practice or people who are in a position to hire actually add inherent value to the fact that we have a diverse applicant?
Yeah. Well, thank you for this question. It's an excellent question. I wish we were there, but I don't think we're there. So I totally understand where you're coming from. And there is some evidence suggesting that diverse teams outperform homogeneous teams. But even this business case is not strong enough to motivate people to hire for diversity. This drive, really part of our human makeup, for going for people who look like ourselves, sometimes called homophobia, is so strong that the business case typically can't outweigh it. So I hear you, where you're coming from, and I wish we were in a world where I could just tell people, look, here's the evidence. There's very nice research that measures the collective intelligence of a team, pretty much like you would measure individual intelligence. So they do lots of different tasks. It's research coming out of MIT and Carnegie Mellon, and they do find that diverse teams, both cognitively diverse teams, but also gender diverse teams, outperform homogeneous teams. But here is somewhat sobering news, maybe for you, and that is if you ask people afterwards, how well do they think their team performed, so before they know it, they will say that if they were in a diverse team, they will expect their team to have performed worse. and they will also report that it wasn't particularly enjoyable. Why was it not enjoyable? Because when we have a diverse team, what we actually want to see happen is happening, and that is we're not falling into groupthink and just run in the same direction, but we actually have a debate and question each other. But that's hard work, right? That's not fun. It's much easier if we're all rooting for the same club and just run in the same direction. So that's why I don't think we're quite where you would like us to be.
Outcomes are better, but people are uncomfortable about it. Interesting.
Yes, yes.
Please.
Hi, my name is Julia, and I'm a student here at the college. I'm wondering, are there certain institutions that are more or less susceptible to gender bias? And if so, what about these institutions facilitates these phenomena? And if not, what is the lesson to be learned about the nature of biases if they have equal presence in different types of institutions?
Yep. So I don't think I can categorize institutions. So I couldn't say it's more or less prevalent in the private sector, the public sector, or an NGO. It has very much to do with the relative fractions of different groups in a particular industry, for example, in a particular sector. So in a heavily female-dominated sector, such as teaching, for example, there's absolutely bias against men. And there's also self-stereotyping of male teachers. In a heavily male-dominated sector, so let's take Silicon Valley, for example, there's absolutely bias against women. But this has less to do, with Silicon Valley or schools. It has something to do with the prevalence of one particular gender in this case, but could also be race. So that's kind of where you have to look. If there's a huge imbalance, that's where we typically see bigger problems. We generally see people being more comfortable with diversity and inclusion in more balanced environments. And that goes back to my earlier point that numbers do matter. So if you are a small minority, if you are the only one or just two out of many, it's much, much harder for you to be taken seriously for your expertise rather than for the demographic characteristics that you represent in that moment.
Can I just follow up? Is there, we are here at the Kennedy School. Is there any room for policy instruments or a role for government here in encouraging these kinds of change?
Yeah, I'm a professor at Kennedy School, so how can I say no to this question? And I wouldn't say no. No, yes, absolutely, of course. So it's actually a very important question because, I happen to be a behavioral economist, so the instruments that I happen to know best and that I study are behavioral designs, right, or nudges. But that doesn't mean that in our toolbox we don't need other instruments as well, right? The fact that we have nudges doesn't mean that we shouldn't have equal rights, right? That doesn't mean that we shouldn't have parental leave policies. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't have flexible work hours. So there are clear incentives and regulations which also matter. But these are just different instruments. So generally, I would just say, have a toolbox. As somebody who would like to influence the world, you have a toolbox at your disposal. Some are just instruments, some are regulations and laws, and then there is this other, I think, so far underused instrument, and that is the nudge.
Yes, please, over here.
Hi, Crystal Huff, Inclusion Through Innovation. Anecdotally, I have been working with a lot of people, particularly women, who are trying to not be punished for self-advocacy in the workplace, and so they have formed little groups for advocating for each other, for promotions and whatnot. I'm wondering if there are studies on this topic, and also if there's a way of applying this to other groups that have been marginalized besides women, because we do a lot of paying attention to white women.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you're right at home here. So there's a faculty member, Hannah Riley-Bowles, here at the Kennedy School, and she has done really important work on this whole question of, is there backlash for being assertive or negotiating for yourself compared to helping each other out? And so, for example, what she found was that if you negotiate for yourself, women are more likely to experience backlash because they're defying these gender norms. They're falling into the Heidi trap. But if women negotiate on behalf of someone else, when I negotiate on behalf of a student of mine, I can tell you I can be a complete lioness. And attorneys, so take attorneys. Attorneys can be very successful at negotiating on behalf of their clients. Doctors can do that. When you are part of an organization, you can negotiate on behalf of the organization. So there are, of all the negotiations that you'll ever be involved in your life, probably 90% are in fact on behalf of someone else. But I love what you're doing. I do think we have to do a much better job, and that's part of my comment on micro inequities before. That even in meetings, I'm now trying to do a better job going back to not only women, but traditionally underrepresented groups and say, you know, this was just a brilliant comment that he made before, and I want to build on that, just to make sure this doesn't fall through the cracks, and we're really acknowledging that. And I think I love your strategy. We should do more of that, really being cognizant that we have to help each other out, because there is backlash if we defy certain norms and roles that come either with our gender or our race or even our nationality.
Back up here, please.
Hi, my name is Jackson. I'm a sophomore at the college. And I'm just wondering what you found are the most commonly held misconceptions about how gender bias manifests itself in whatever space it be, whether it's the workplace or like a college environment, for those of us who are in the college setting.
Okay, the biggest misconception, it doesn't exist. But I have a longer answer. But that's not so unusual, that people would say, and you know, there are others maybe who fall into this trap, not me. People who think they're great at interviewing, and again, they would be completely unbiased. So yes, so that's a big challenge for us. I also think that the idea that we can do it on our own can be a misconception. And some people feel like, you know, it's just them. You know, they're obviously not negotiating assertively enough. They're obviously not contributing enough to classroom participation. It's all them. And I think that's another misconception, because, of course, stereotypes don't only affect how I evaluate you, but they also affect how I evaluate myself. That self-stereotyping is well and alive. And so I think that's another important misconception that we want to think about.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for taking the time. I'm Swati Saha. I work with McKinsey. Two very quick questions. First, organizations, the first step they usually take, like you pointed out, is like start hiring more numbers from diverse backgrounds, right? What if this approach is fundamentally flawed, and maybe we need to shift our lens to start hiring by looking at diversity of thought rather than this thing around a higher, you know, racial, gender, or generational diversity, right? So that's one. And second, how do we get more men involved? Because I feel like we started with he for she. It worked to a certain degree, but I've tried and miserably failed at just making men a part of the conversation.
Yeah. So let me start with the second question. I don't think I have a brilliant notch there, though. But yes, it's absolutely important that, you know, gender is about women and men, and race is about whites and people of color. So that's a challenge that we have. And when I teach a course at the Kennedy School on gender, I will have, you know, 95% women, or maybe 98% women. So I am teaching a new course this year. That's a course on behavioral economics for organizations, where I broaden the topic. And I'm basically arguing that diversity and inclusion is just a subcategory of a bigger problem that defines the health of an organization. And so we don't only talk about inclusion and diversity and equality, but also about topics such as ethics, honesty, compliance. And they both have a similar kind of psychology behind them, and that is that good people like you and me fall prey to these kinds of issues. So good people make mistakes, might overclaim, you know, on expenses, or might not completely report truthfully on their tax statements, or just small kind of infractions. And so I'm arguing that the same is happening for gender bias. So that's a way, I think, to broaden the discussion and to include many more people who might not necessarily come to a course on race or gender. So that's just kind of one concrete idea. Remind me your first, sorry, now I...
About diversity of thought.
Oh, diversity of thought. Yeah, so cognitive diversity, very important. I mean, no question, cognitive diversity is very important. In many ways, maybe the blind evaluations do that, right? If you, not exactly what you're thinking, but it gets close to it as in saying, we don't care about demographics. We actually care about what a person brings to the table, what kind of skills, what kind of knowledge, what kind of contributions a person can make to the organizations or the team that we have. And I think that gets actually quite close to what you have in mind.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Ashley, and I work in human resources at an organization in Cambridge. I'm curious to get your thoughts on the new Massachusetts legislation about pay equity, which makes, in 2018, it illegal for employers to ask about salary history and other transparency about salary. So do you think a law change will be enough to change behavior and create diversity?
Yep. I mean, I think we can say with almost certainty it's not going to be enough. But it's an amazing step. So I'm super excited about generally attempts to increase transparency. That's at the federal level, but also in Massachusetts. And I'm very excited about this new law, which is going to keep us employers, more generally employers, from asking people about what they've made previously, right? Because the concern, of course, is that if we know there are differences, either racial or gender differences, in initial negotiations, that's just self-perpetuating and increasing, I mean, there's empirical evidence for that, increasing the gap, the pay gap, for example, between women and men. So I think that in itself is a great step in the right direction. Is it going to be enough? No. There's many, many different levers of behavior. But I'm very excited and proud that Massachusetts is taking the lead on this.
Let's go back up here.
Hi, my name's Alicia. I am the director for the Office of Sexual Assault Prevention Response here at Harvard. Gender equity is obviously very tied to the work that we do, so I was very excited to come and hear this. Thank you for taking the time. My question is about how we start to include transgender and gender nonconforming people in this conversation as well. We know that trans and gender nonconforming folks are uniquely vulnerable to both sexual and gender-based violence, but also joblessness. And so I'm wondering what it looks like to either start research around this or expand the research to be inclusive of folks who don't identify on that gender binary.
Yeah. I mean, first, thank you for the important work that you're doing and for a very important question. But I have to tell you, I won't have a great answer. So in my book, I had to be very careful about to what degree can we generalize from now hundreds of studies on gender to other differences that we want to care about. And so in some dimensions, so even on race, I had less evidence than on gender. But I tried to be clear, when did I feel like we had enough evidence on race to say the same type of an intervention, for example, would also work for being inclusive in terms of race. In terms of sexual orientation, for example, the evidence is super thin. So I can't tell you I don't have a good answer. The only good news I have is the volume of research is increasing, but slowly. But I also have to say, 15 years ago, 17 years ago, when I started out at Harvard as an assistant professor, the evidence on gender was very thin. When gender studies had done a lot of very important work, but the empirical evidence, the data, was very thin. And that field has really exploded in the last 17 years. Now, it's, you have to be a bit patient, which I know is not a great answer, but I couldn't have written the book 17 years ago that I have written now, because now I have literally hundreds of studies which have evaluated the impact of an intervention in terms of gender equality. We're not there yet, neither on race nor on sexual orientation.
Thank you.
I think we have time to take a couple more questions, so go back up here.
Hi, my name is Will. I'm a sophomore at the college. And I'm just curious because you spoke about, I think, the British government, which now has blind applications rights. They don't care about maybe gender or race. And just as a college student, I'm wondering what your thoughts are about affirmative action, which is a process that deliberately takes things like gender and race into account in order to obtain a more diverse student body.
Yeah. I mean, that goes back to an earlier discussion. Should we be explicit about diversity numbers? my honest answer is I don't have a very strong view. It's a different instrument. It's not a behavioral design. It's not a nudge. It's a hammer. It's like a quota. But there is certainly evidence that affirmative action and quotas, for that matter, change numbers very quickly, and that by changing numbers, we can change mindsets. Right? So that makes me very positive about affirmative action, about quotas, because it can actually speed up the process that you were concerned about before. When are we ever going to change, our beliefs? It can do that. So Rohini Pandey, a faculty member here at the Kennedy School, did some amazing work in India, because India, unbeknownst to most people, is one of the earliest countries to introduce reservations or quotas. In particular, they focused on local politicians and reserved a third of village head positions for women. And because the third was picked out of a hat randomly, researchers over now, this was introduced in 1993, so over now more than 20 years, could evaluate what difference really make. And they did find that after having been exposed to 2 female leaders in your village, your mindsets are starting to change. So not one didn't do it, but if you have been living in a village which by chance was exposed to female leaders twice, you're starting to associate leadership with women. So in that sense, I am extremely, extremely favorable and positive. But I wouldn't be an economist if there wasn't a but. There's benefits and costs to almost anything we do. And yes, there are also costs. And people who have been part of quota regimes and a part of affirmative actions benefited from them would absolutely report that that hasn't always served them well, because they were perceived as a quota woman and not taken quite as seriously, for example, on a corporate board. So again, there's interesting research in Norway, which was one of the early countries to to introduce quotas on corporate boards. So 40% between 2003 and 2006 has increased numbers very quickly, but so far hasn't been correlated with company performance. In fact, research suggests that the short-term effects were negative. The company performance went down. Now you might wonder why that is, and that's a longer discussion. It's hard to kind of really pinpoint why it really didn't work. One of the hypotheses is that new teams, independent of what they look like, new teams very rarely outperform old teams, because it takes time for teams to perform. So maybe in 10 years we'll have this discussion again here, and I'll tell you Norway now has figured it out with the quotas. But for now, we also have to take the costs seriously. So there are benefits to quotas and affirmative actions, absolutely. Changes numbers, changes mindsets, amazing, very quickly, but there's also cost.
We're a little bit over time, but I want to take one last question from down here, please.
I'm a little short here. Thank you. My name is Diawe, and I'm at the Education School. And I'm interested in learning more about your perspective on diversity programs, particularly when you said that diversity programs weren't effective, explaining more on that, and then just your general ideas on how diversity programs could incorporate behavioral design.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this important question. So I think the biggest message maybe that I wanted to leave with you was that we don't measure nearly enough, right? So mostly we don't know. And then of the few studies that actually have looked at either the correlation, so one big body of research has looked at the correlation between whether an organization has a diversity program. That was just the variable. Do you have a diversity program or not? And is that correlated? So a huge sample of companies in the United States over about 20 years. If you have a diversity training program, is that correlated in any way with the diversity of your workforce? And that correlation coefficient is basically 0, right? Now you will say this is not causation, but no correlation is not particularly encouraging. But then some other people have actually done randomized controlled trials or real experiments. And often they've actually not happened in a corporate context, but for example in schools. So one of the studies, quite literally, has given diversity training to about 50 classes. That was the treatment group, and then they had 50 classes which didn't get the training, that was the control group. And then the dependent variable was whether these kids then were more likely to play with kids who look different from themselves, whether their attitudes towards other kids changed, whether they were more likely to include and invite to birthday parties, for example, kids who looked very different from themselves, and they found basically nothing. So that's kind of the evidence. That's the best evidence I have, which are these randomized controlled trials, which really tried something on a subset of the population, and then had a control group and really, measured whether it had an effect. Now, I think the more important question is, where could we see hope? And I have to say this is kind of hope rather than much evidence. But there is quite a big body of research examining how impactful can we be in generally de-biasing mindsets, right? And this is beyond gender biases or racial biases, but just generally cognitive biases. So there's lots of biases which affect our decision making all the time. And so I'm drawing a bit on that research. And that research suggests that the more we can turn from training to capacity building, the more effective the intervention is going to be. So what that means is, I'm not just raising your awareness, but I am, even in the training, starting to think through with you, so what does this mean when you go back to your organization or to your classroom? What does it mean for your daily life? So that actually means in the diversity training program, start thinking about, okay, so what is the list that you're going to create? Who is going to be part of that group? How can you create a list of micro inequities that you want to overcome? What kind of levers can you use in your organization to then make this behaviorally relevant? So really go into capacity building. And I think in our classrooms, in our executive education programs, we are actually trying that very much. Move more into really leaving the classroom behind and getting people close to kind of experiences that are very close to kind of real life, and helping them imagine what looks like a great idea now. What would that look like if they're back in their organizations? So that's the hope I have, that the more we move from, in fact, I stole capacity building from the terminology that is now used in financial literacy training. So financial literacy training now says that's wrong. We shouldn't do literacy. We have to do financial capacity building. And I think the same is true for diversity training.
Well, you mentioned the word hope, and actually I think that's a wonderful thought to end tonight with, because counter to my previous sense where I was saying I was feeling quite sad about not being able to change human nature, I feel very hopeful now.
Thank you.
Because what I love about everything that you've talked about tonight is that these are very actionable things, right? It's not as if we need to, that we can affect sweeping cultural change, but through actionable steps, and test, retest, measure, gather the data to see what's working. And so I want to thank you very much for that, and thank you all for coming, and hopefully you feel equally hopeful that you can go forward into the organizations that you'll join or represent now, and do Professor Bohnet's homework first and foremost tomorrow morning, and create the kind of organizations you want to be part of as well. So thank you so very much.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you. And thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.